"I know your secret," said the maid's son. No one believed the words of that poor, almost invisible boy in that powerful environment. Until the truth came out, and what was revealed was unbelievable, making the millionaire freeze in front of everyone. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories that impact lives. That night, the imposing white marble mansion was lit up like a castle, with luxury cars parked in a row and men in ties walking through the main gate, all eager to participate in a decisive meeting that promised to generate millions in contracts and business alliances. Amid crystal glasses serving imported champagne and the discreet sound of a piano echoing through the hall, the mansion's owner, millionaire Victor Callahan, displayed his sovereign posture, greeting guests with a smile laden with arrogance and an air of superiority. Victor was known for his skill in manipulating business deals and for always coming out on top in any negotiation. But he was also feared for his coldness and the way he looked down on those he considered inferior. As business people gathered around the long mahogany table to discuss contract details, almost no one noticed the figure of a woman kneeling discreetly in the background, scrubbing the marble floor with firm movements, wearing a simple blue uniform and yellow gloves that revealed her position in the house. It was Marissa Gomez, the maid. Marissa, silent and dedicated, carried out her tasks without looking up, but her heart raced as she knew that something terrible was hovering in that room and that it could explode at any moment. She wasn't alone. Hidden behind one of the columns, watching everything with watchful eyes, was her son, Rafael Gomez, a 13-year-old boy in simple clothes and a worn backpack, who carried more than just notebooks. He had a weight on his conscience. Rafael had witnessed something none of those men in suits could have imagined, something that could turn that entire night of power and celebration into a true nightmare for the host. The boy watched Victor intensely, remembering the words he had heard hidden in the library hours before, words loaded with cynicism and secrets that none of the businessmen present even suspected. Despite his young age, Rafael understood the gravity of what he knew, and a mixture of fear and courage made his hands sweat as he decided whether or not to speak in front of all those powerful men. Victor, on the other hand, seemed to delight in every detail of the party, laughing loudly, discreetly mocking the maid in the corner, and treating the guests like pieces on a board where only he knew how to move the moves. No one, not even the closest lawyers, could have imagined that a skinny boy, the maid's son, had a secret in his mind capable of shaking the foundations of that night. The atmosphere, although elegant, hid an invisible tension. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, but behind every look there was suspicion about what was really being discussed at that meeting. Rafael knew that if he didn't speak, the injustice would be confirmed, and Victor would emerge victorious once again, at the cost of lies and manipulation. But he also knew that if he had the courage to reveal what he had heard, he would put at risk not only his safety, but also that of his mother, who depended on that job for her survival. And as the piano stopped and silence took over the room to begin the most important moment of the night, Rafael clenched his fists and took a deep breath, determined to face the most powerful man in that room. The silence that gripped the room seemed to carry an invisible weight as the guests settled into their chairs to listen to Victor Callahan's speech. He remained standing, with the posture of someone who controlled not only that evening, but also the fate of everyone gathered there. He raised his crystal glass triumphantly, sporting a calculated smile, as if he had already secured the victory before any signatures were even made. The glow of the chandeliers reflected on his impeccable suit, and every word that came out of his mouth was charged with pride, as if it were an indisputable decree. Marissa, still kneeling near the corner of the room, scrubbed the floor with slow movements, trying to remain invisible, but feeling every nerve in her body vibrate with anxiety. Her heart raced, not only from the fear of losing her job if something went wrong, but mainly because she knew her son carried a secret that could transform the evening into chaos. Raphael, partially hidden behind the column, took a deep breath and stared at the scene, realizing that the moment of revelation was approaching. He was not just a curious boy, but someone who had witnessed the naked truth, a truth that, if it came to light, would shatter the image of power Victor had built over the years. As the businessmen whispered among themselves and pored over pages of contracts spread out on the mahogany table, Raphael relived the scene from the previous afternoon, when he had gotten lost in the mansion's corridors, searching for the library. The boy had always been fascinated by books, and when he discreetly opened the door, he found himself confronted with an unexpected sight. Victor Callahan in low conversation with a silent partner, a man wearing a dark hat and a gruff voice, discussing dirty strategies to deceive the others present that evening. Raphael remained motionless among the bookshelves, holding his breath so as not to be discovered, and listened to every word of the conspiracy: falsified contracts, omitted clauses, and embezzled figures. In that instant, he realized that Victor was not only arrogant, but a traitor ready to rob those who trusted him. Since then, the secret had burned within him like an unquenchable flame, and now, before that audience of proud men and his own mother kneeling on the floor, he knew he could not remain silent. Victor, oblivious to the steady gaze Raphael was giving him from afar, continued his superior's speech, extolling his achievements and insinuating that everyone there only prospered because they followed his ideas and methods. Each sentence was accompanied by forced laughter from some sycophants and tense expressions from others who, despite his pomp, suspected something was wrong. The millionaire leaned across the table, lightly banging his fist to reinforce his authority, making it clear that nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop him from closing this deal. Raphael felt a lump in his throat, but also a new strength grow in his chest. He was no longer facing an untouchable man, but someone harboring a rotten and shameful secret that needed to be exposed for all to see. Marissa looked up for a moment and met her son's gaze, as if sensing something was about to happen, and her heart nearly stopped. Raphael took another deep breath, his fingers trembled against the worn backpack, and silently decided there would be no turning back. He would stand up and speak. Raphael felt his legs tremble as he took his first step out of the column's shadow, and the eyes of some guests turned to him strangely, as if an intruder had just crossed the invisible border that separated the world of the powerful from the world of the invisible. The piano music had ceased a few minutes ago, and the silence that hung over the room was now interrupted only by the creaking of the wooden floor beneath the boy's unsteady feet. Victor, noticing the movement, raised his eyebrows in contempt, as if the boy were nothing more than a foolish inconvenience in a moment of greatness. "What does this boy think he's doing here?" one of the guests muttered, eliciting muffled chuckles. But Raphael didn't back down. His gaze was fixed on Victor, as if each step were a declaration of courage against the arrogance that suffocated the room. Beside him, Marissa almost dropped the bucket of water she was holding, her eyes filled with tears of fear and pride at the same time, as she knew her son was about to cross a line of no return. Victor crossed his arms and tilted his head to the side, sporting a mocking smile that betrayed his utter contempt. "So, young man," he teased, his voice echoing with irony, "are you going to teach us how to clean the floor as well as your mother? Because that's what you should be doing, not interrupting busy men." The businessman chuckled quietly, complicit in the sarcasm, unaware that what was about to happen would radically change the course of that evening. Raphael stopped in the middle of the room, took a deep breath, and, without stuttering, raised his voice for the first time. "I didn't come here to play games, Mr. Callahan. I know what you're hiding." A murmur ran through the room like lightning, and some men frowned, surprised by the unexpected firmness of a 13-year-old boy. Raphael's tone wasn't insolent. but convinced, charged with a truth no one there imagined he could carry. Marissa put her hand to her mouth, silently praying that her son's words would not have irreversible consequences. Victor's taunt turned into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the room like mocking thunder. "You know what, boy?" he said, shaking his head mockingly. "Children make up stories all the time. They must have heard some fairy tale, and now they think they can entertain us." But his laughter began to die when he realized Raphael wasn't backing away, wasn't trembling, and wasn't looking away. The boy took another step closer, approaching the mahogany table strewn with documents and glasses, and his voice echoed even more clearly. "I know your secret, Mr. Callahan." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a glass falling from a guest's hand and shattering on the floor. Eyes turned to Victor, waiting for a reaction, and for a moment, his face lost color before quickly hiding it with a tight smile. Raphael, however, had already planted the seed of doubt in everyone present, and now the tension was rising like a rope about to snap. The impact of those words was immediate. The guests, who seconds before had been laughing and toasting with an air of superiority, now looked at each other in complete astonishment, as if unsure whether to laugh even harder at the boy's boldness or be concerned about his confident tone. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, trying to break the tension, but his hand trembled slightly over the papers. "A secret," another businessman repeated, frowning. Victor, sensing the growing discomfort, raised his hand to silence the whispers and walked a few steps to the center of the room, his leather shoes echoing on the marble Marissa had cleaned minutes before. He leaned in front of Raphael, looking him up and down as if observing an insignificant insect. "Watch your words, boy," he said in a cold voice, almost a threatening whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Marissa, in the background, felt a shiver run down her spine, fearing her son's audacity but unable to move him. Raphael, however, kept his feet firmly on the ground, and his silence in the face of Victor's intimidation was stronger than any words. The tension grew with each passing second. Some guests tried to hide it with giggles, but their expressions couldn't hide their curiosity. After all, what secret could a 13-year-old boy know about such a powerful man? Victor tried to force another smile, but the mask of confidence was beginning to crack. "Are you really going to listen to a child?" he said, raising his hands in mock disdain. "He's nothing more than a curious boy, probably making up stories because he doesn't know his place." But Raphael was unfazed. With his eyes fixed on Victor, his voice was firm. "I'm not making anything up. I was there when you spoke. I heard every word." The room fell silent again, as if everyone had stopped breathing simultaneously. One of the partners present sat back slightly in his chair, while another raised his hand to his chin, puzzled. Victor paled for a moment, but quickly regained control, crossing his arms as if this were nothing more than a baseless accusation. Raphael took a deep breath, his sweaty hands tightening on the strap of his backpack, and then took the first step toward the revelation. "I was in the library, behind the bookshelves," he began, his voice clear and strong. "You were all preparing for tonight. But you, Mr. Callahan, you weren't preparing anything for them. I heard you when you said you were going to deceive everyone here, that you were going to change the contract values, that you were going to walk away with most of the money yourself." The murmur that followed was deafening. The guests rose from their chairs, some indignant, others in complete shock, and Victor raised his hand in defense. "Lies. All lies," he shouted, but the uncertainty in his tone only reinforced the accusation. Marissa put her hand to her chest, feeling her legs weaken, but she didn't take her eyes off her son, who had now become the voice of truth before so many. And in that moment, Raphael knew there was no turning back. The secret was exposed, and the millionaire was cornered. The buzz filled the room like a rapidly spreading wildfire, with overlapping voices, suspicious glances, and sudden movements as businessmen rose from their chairs to face Victor Callahan head-on. Raphael, still in the center, stood his ground, even as his heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't back down now. "I heard you clearly," he said, his voice cutting through the surrounding noise. "You said you would change the numbers, that you would hide the amounts so no one would notice, and that when this contract was signed, everyone here would be left with crumbs while you would be the sole beneficiary." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. One of the lawyers blurted out, "Those clauses." I had noticed discrepancies. Raphael's revelation was beginning to resonate with those already suspicious. Victor, feeling the pressure, tried to laugh, but his laugh sounded forced, almost choked. "Are you going to believe a kid? A boy who should be sweeping the floor with his mother?" But Raphael's firmness, in repeating what he had heard, left each word like a direct blow to the millionaire's wall of arrogance. Marissa trembled in the background, but her tear-filled eyes shone with pride. Her son, who had grown up hearing that the humble should always bow their heads, now spoke before the rich as an equal, or perhaps even stronger. Raphael described the scene in the library in detail, the leathery smell of old books, the sound of the door creaking, and, above all, Victor's voice, firm and calculating, confessing his betrayal to a mysterious partner. "He said you were just chess pieces, that all he had to do was push each of you in the right direction, and you would do exactly what he wanted." One of the older businessmen slammed his hand on the table, his face flushed with indignation. "Is that true, Callahan? You said that." Victor tried to react, but his voice faltered. His image as an unbreakable sovereign was beginning to crumble before the audience that had previously revered him. Raphael, feeling the weight of his own courage, continued, without hesitation, to expose every detail as if turning on a lamp in a dark room. Victor, now cornered, raised his voice, trying to regain his authority. "Enough. I won't give a platform to an insolent boy. This is ridiculous." But his desperate tone only revealed his fragility, and the looks around him were no longer of respect, but of suspicion and distrust. Some businessmen murmured among themselves, comparing Raphael's reports with obscure points they had already noted in the contract, and each new confirmation was another crack in the wall of power Victor had built. Raphael, seizing the moment, stepped forward and concluded, "You can laugh at me, but you can't erase the truth. I was there, I heard. And if you lie, sooner or later, everyone will find out." The room fell into absolute silence, heavy as lead, until one of the most influential guests stood and said firmly, "Victor, we want explanations now." Victor swallowed hard, feeling the siege closing in, and for a moment, the arrogance he had so often displayed disappeared from his face. Victor lifted his chin, trying to regain the tone of authority that had always given him power over any room, and slammed his hand down on the table, making the crystal glasses shake and some guests jump. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room, trying to hide the fear that was beginning to take shape in his eyes. "I will not allow this event, designed to seal one of the biggest deals of the decade, to be tarnished by the words of an insolent child." His eyes narrowed on Raphael, and a cold smile appeared on his lips. "Tell me, boy, what would you gain by making up this story? Money? Recognition? Or was it your mother who taught you to meddle where you don't belong?" The room held its breath at the cruelty of the comment. Marissa, still kneeling in the back, felt her heart freeze, but she didn't move, knowing that any reaction could only worsen the situation. Raphael, however, was undeterred. His voice, though lower, sounded firmer than the millionaire's. "I don't want anything, Mr. Callahan. I just want everyone here to know the truth you're trying to hide." The businessmen began exchanging uneasy glances, and one of them, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, raised his voice. "Victor, the boy speaks in too many details to be a fabrication. If you have nothing to hide, prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a sentence, and Victor felt the pressure build like an unbearable weight on his shoulders. Trying to regain control, he laughed, but the sound sounded forced and bitter. "Prove it. I don't have to prove anything to you. This contract should already be signed. Let's not waste time with nonsense." But his words sounded weak, and even those closest to him began to back away, realizing they might be dealing with something much bigger than a simple rumor. Raphael took advantage of the silence that followed and, with a courage he didn't even know he possessed, added, "You didn't just say you were going to deceive everyone. You also told how you would do it. I heard every plan, every detail." The room stirred again, like a raging sea about to burst into waves of fury. Victor, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet, changed tactics and tried to turn the tables with pure intimidation. He approached Raphael, his face inches from the boy's, and his voice was low and menacing. "You don't know who you're messing with. I can end your life and your mother's in seconds." The silence that followed was heavy, as if everyone expected Raphael to retreat in panic, but the boy stood firm, his gaze piercing the millionaire's eyes like a blade. "I may not know everything, Mr. Callahan," he replied, "but I know enough that no one here will trust you anymore." A murmur of approval ran through the room, and several businessmen stood, demanding clearer explanations. Marissa finally rose from the floor, her face serious and her eyes teary, discreetly standing behind her son like a silent shield. Victor, for the first time, felt small in front of an audience that no longer saw him as untouchable, but as a cornered man about to fall. Raphael took a deep breath, looking at every face in the room, as if to ensure his words reached everyone, without exception. The silence was absolute, heavy, interrupted only by the soft clink of a glass forgotten on the table. "What I heard wasn't a simple comment," he said, his clear voice cutting through the air. "I was behind the shelves, and I heard you say you had prepared different contracts. One to show everyone, and another to use at the right time. One that would make you believe you would receive your fair share, but in practice would hand over almost everything to him alone." Eyes widened, and one of the lawyers, already suspicious of certain alterations, swallowed hard, unable to hide his silent confirmation. Victor tried to shake his head, laughing in disbelief, but his expression was too tense to be convincing. Raphael, without hesitation, continued, "I also heard you say no one would suspect anything because everyone was blinded by their trust in your name. Those were the words you used." The murmur returned, now filled with indignation, and the eyes that had once revered Victor now pierced him with suspicion. Victor raised his hands, trying to interrupt the boy, but the businessmen demanded to hear more. "Let him speak," one of them shouted, while another slammed the table furiously. Raphael lifted his chin and continued, "You weren't just planning to deceive. You bragged about it, saying everyone here was too naive to realize it. You even laughed, as if you'd already won before this night even began." The boy paused, and the memory of that cruel laugh in the library returned to him, a sound he would never forget. "I may be a boy," Raphael said, "but I know the difference between a simple conversation and a conspiracy. And what I heard was a conspiracy." Marissa, in the background, clapped her hand over her mouth, feeling her heart race, but also a strange force coursing through her veins, pride. The son she had always wanted to protect was now protecting the truth, exposing a man no one had ever dared to confront. Victor, no longer possessing the absolute control he'd cultivated, took a step back, sweat dripping discreetly down his forehead, though he tried to hide it with more mockery. "This is absurd. Are you really listening to a kid?" He could have made the whole thing up, but his voice no longer carried the same weight as before, and the businessmen no longer seemed convinced. One of those present, a serious-looking foreign investor, stood up and said, "Callahan, if this is a lie, show us the original versions of the contract, right here and now." The demand fell like a bombshell in the room. Victor stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but Raphael seized the opportunity to deliver the final blow. "He won't show them, because I heard him say the real versions were hidden in the office safe, just waiting for the right moment to be used." The shock was collective, and everyone turned to Victor, who froze at the revelation. His secret was being exposed detail by detail, and there was no longer any way to pretend it didn't exist. The hall, which minutes before had exuded luxury and arrogance, now seethed with tension, each guest speaking at once, deep voices overlapping in indignation and demands. "We want to see that safe," shouted one member, his face red with rage. "If there's nothing to hide, open it now," another added, slamming his hand on the table so hard that the bowl in front of him toppled over. Victor raised his hands, trying to calm the group, but his voice sounded shaky, something that rarely happened and that didn't go unnoticed. "Gentlemen, please don't listen to a child. This boy is just confusing you," he said, with a forced laugh that convinced no one. Raphael, standing, didn't back down an inch, and his firmness seemed to give his words more weight than the years of experience of these powerful men. Marissa, her hands pressed against her chest, watched the scene with teary eyes, knowing that, in that moment, her son's courage had changed the course of the night. Some businessmen began to stand and gather, like a silent force against the millionaire who had previously dominated everything with a simple glance. An experienced lawyer adjusted his glasses and said loudly, "Callahan, if what the boy says is a lie, you have the chance to prove it now. Open the safe in front of us all." The words echoed through the room like a verdict, and Victor swallowed hard. He tried to regain his composure, puffing out his chest, but his rapid breathing and the beads of sweat running down his forehead betrayed the panic growing within him. "This is an outrage," he shouted, gesturing wildly. "You're treating me like a criminal based on stories invented by a boy." But no one else seemed willing to give in to his theatrics. Raphael, taking advantage of the silence that followed, added, "If you have nothing to hide, why are you so afraid to open the safe?" His simple but sharp words cut like a blade, eliciting murmurs of approval from those present. Victor, cornered as never before, began to lose his composure. His voice faltered as he tried to make up an excuse, saying the safe key wasn't there, that it had been left on another floor, but one of the house's security guards confirmed, embarrassed, that the key was hidden in his boss's own pocket. The collective murmur turned into a roar of indignation. "Show us now," demanded the foreign investor, his voice firm and icy, like an order brooking no refusal. Victor took 2 steps back, looking around like a cornered animal, the arrogant gleam in his eyes replaced by a dark, desperate fear. Marissa, still in the background, closed her eyes for a moment, as if offering a silent prayer that her son would remain protected from the fury that might come. Raphael, unafraid, crossed his arms and faced Victor head-on, increasingly certain that the truth was about to explode before everyone. And then, amidst the tense silence that dominated the room, the millionaire took the key from his pocket with trembling hands, knowing that opening that safe would mean the end of his farce. Victor walked to the side wall of the room, where a large, gilded painting hid the built-in safe. His movements, once firm and authoritative, were now heavy, as if each step were an impossible burden to carry. The entire room watched in silence, all eyes fixed on him, each awaiting the definitive proof that could bury his reputation forever. With trembling hands, he pushed aside the painting, revealing the gleaming metal door. The dry sound of the key turning in the lock echoed like thunder in the sepulchral silence, and some guests leaned forward, holding their breath. Victor hesitated for a few seconds, as if gathering the courage to open it, but he knew there was no turning back. Finally, he pulled the safe door open, and the metallic creak seemed to cut the air like a sentence. Inside, thick folders, bound documents, and sealed envelopes lay piled high, organized with almost maniacal perfection. The businessmen stood up together, as if a collective instinct was pushing them closer to the truth. Raphael took a few steps forward, his heart racing, but his eyes fixed on the inside of the safe, immediately recognizing the folders identical to the ones he had heard Victor mention in the library conversation. "These are the ones," he said, his voice clear and firm, breaking the silence and drawing even more looks of disbelief. One of the lawyers approached, removed one of the folders, and slowly opened it, scattering pages across the mahogany desk. The sound of pages being flipped filled the room, and each line read confirmed what Raphael had denounced: falsified contracts, hidden figures, fraudulent clauses carefully crafted to benefit only Victor. "My God," muttered one of the businessmen, putting his hand to his head. "It's true. Everything he said is true." The murmur turned to an uproar, voices raised in outrage, and Victor's name, once spoken with respect and admiration, was now spat out with hatred and indignation. Victor tried to move forward to grab the papers, but was stopped by two partners who firmly pushed him back. Marissa, standing in the background, let the tears flow as she saw that her son's courage had prevailed, transforming the words of a disbelieving boy into the most powerful weapon against lies. Raphael stood firm, still breathing heavily, but unwavering in the face of the chaos that now unfolded. The businessmen argued among themselves, demanding immediate answers, and one of the foreign investors, visibly furious, pointed at Victor and said, "You betrayed us. You were ready to steal everything from under our noses." Victor, panicked, tried to justify himself, his voice wavering. "No, you don't understand. This isn't what it seems." But his words were drowned out by the chorus of protests and accusations rising from all sides. Raphael then raised his voice one last time, cutting through the confusion. "I told you I knew your secret, and now everyone knows it too." The entire room fell silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the revelation, before erupting again in shouts of indignation surrounding the millionaire. The room turned into a verbal battleground, each guest raising their voice amid accusations and indignation, and Victor Callahan, accustomed to dominating any room with his haughty gaze, now looked like a cornered man, desperate for a way out. His sweaty hands trembled as he tried to retrieve the documents scattered on the table, but was stopped by firm arms that shoved him back contemptuously. "Don't touch them," shouted one of the partners, his face flushed with rage. Victor raised his hands in defense, breathing heavily, trying to transform his fragility into a display of false control. "You're making a mistake," he exclaimed, his voice cracking, lacking the strength that once drew crowds. "These documents have been tampered with. It's not what it looks like." But no one believed his flimsy excuses anymore. Raphael, standing beside his mother, watched seriously, knowing that this was the moment when Victor would show his true face. Not that of a powerful tycoon, but that of a desperate man with no way out. In an attempt to turn the tables, Victor narrowed his eyes and pointed an accusing finger at Raphael, his voice rising again, now filled with hatred. "Are you really going to trust a kid? He broke into my library, rummaged where he shouldn't have, heard things out of context, and now he's making up stories to destroy me." The businessmen, however, were no longer swayed by his venomous rhetoric. Some even laughed scornfully, others crossed their arms, waiting for plausible explanations that would never come. Raphael, undeterred, replied firmly, "I didn't break in at all. I was there by chance, but I heard everything. And you yourself said you would hide those contracts in the safe. And where are they now?" "Exactly where I said they would be." The boy's answer fell like a hammer, eliciting murmurs of approval from the audience, while Victor stammered, unable to counter with logic. The millionaire, whom he had previously ridiculed, was now the one being ridiculed. Desperation made Victor change his strategy once again. He began pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly, trying to play the victim in front of those present. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice thick with false emotion. "I built this company. I gave all of you opportunities, and now you want to destroy me based on accusations from a boy and a maid." Marissa lifted her face, previously restrained, and took 2 steps forward, her voice as firm as ever. "These aren't accusations, Mr. Callahan. They're truths. Truths you tried to hide because you believed no one would have the courage to confront you." The room fell silent for a few seconds before the unexpected strength of this woman, until then invisible to the eyes of the powerful. Victor, feeling increasingly cornered, looked around for allies, but found only hard faces, cold gazes, and expressions of contempt. For the first time in many years, he was alone, and his downfall seemed inevitable. Victor Callahan, already stripped of the veneer of confidence that had always enveloped him, let out an uncontrolled scream, his voice hoarse and filled with fury, echoing through the hall like thunder. "You all owe me. I built every brick of this fortune, and without me, none of you would have anything." His wild eyes darted from face to face, but instead of reverence, he found only contempt and revulsion. Some businessmen immediately stood up, pointing their fingers in his direction, demanding explanations he no longer had the strength to give. The weight of the silence, punctuated by indignant voices, made the mansion tremble more than any storm outside. Raphael, standing beside his mother, watched without looking away, realizing that the marble giant everyone believed to be unshakable was nothing more than a cornered, fragile man, stripped of his mask. Victor tried to shout louder to drown out the voices, but his every word was drowned out by protests that were gaining strength, like a chorus of justice finally rising up against years of manipulation. In a desperate gesture, Victor rushed to the table, grabbed some papers, and tore them to shreds, attempting to destroy the evidence in front of everyone. The sharp crack of the paper being torn apart drew a collective cry of indignation, and 2 businessmen rushed to grab his hands, preventing him from destroying any more documents. "This is a confession," one of them yelled, his face red with fury. Only someone guilty would try to erase evidence like that. Raphael, his heart racing, stepped forward and raised his voice for all to hear. He's showing his true colors. He's not a leader. He's not a respectable man. He's just a coward trying to hide what he did. The boy's words echoed through the room, cutting through the tumult and momentarily silencing the discussions. It was as if everyone had stopped to absorb the fact that the truth was coming not from lawyers, nor from veteran partners, but from the firm mouth of a 13-year-old boy. Victor, breathing heavily, broke free from the men holding him and glared at Raphael with hatred, his eyes blazing like embers about to set everything ablaze. You ruined my life," he shouted, his voice almost a roar. "Who do you think you are, confronting me like this? A boy with nothing, a maid's son, daring to challenge a man like me." The room held its breath, and Marissa, standing firmly behind her son, held his shoulder like a silent shield. Raphael, unblinking, replied calmly, but with a strength no one expected. "I'm just someone who heard the truth and had the courage to speak it. And today, Mr. Callahan, it's no longer your money that decides. It's the truth." A deathly silence fell over the room, and the businessmen, one by one, began to turn definitively against Victor. The image of power he had so cultivated had crumbled, and now he was just a man surrounded by eyes crying out for justice. The room boiled like a pot about to boil over, each businessman demanding explanations, each voice joining in a chorus of accusations that echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Victor Callahan, panting and red-faced, circled like a cornered animal, unsure of who to look at or what to say to regain the respect he'd lost. "You betrayed us, Victor," shouted one of the oldest partners, his clenched fist shaking with indignation. "After all these years, after all the trust, this is what you planned for us." Others pounded the table, Some tore up pages of contracts before his eyes, as if symbolically destroying the farce he'd created. Raphael, standing firmly by his mother's side, watched the scene in silence, but his expression conveyed something no one expected from a young boy: the seriousness and courage of someone who wouldn't back down from the truth. Victor, for his part, tried to defend himself with disjointed words, but each justification sounded like further confirmation of his guilt. The foreign investor, a cold and calculating man, slowly rose, and silence fell over the room as if everyone awaited a final verdict. "Callahan," he said in a firm and merciless tone, "your leadership is over. This is the end of your empire." The words fell like sharp blades on the millionaire, who staggered back, as if he'd been physically struck. Some businessmen were already talking about canceling the contract, others about filing immediate lawsuits, and the hall's security began to move closer, as if sensing the situation could spiral out of control. Raphael took a deep breath, remembering the moment he'd heard everything in the library, and now he understood that every detail he'd committed to memory had served to expose, before everyone, the corruption Victor had tried so hard to hide. Marissa, overcome with emotion, squeezed her son's hand, murmuring softly, "You did what no man here had the courage to do." Victor, in a final act of desperation, raised his hands and shouted, "You can't do this to me. I am Victor Callahan. Without me, none of this would exist." But the tone was no longer one of sovereignty, but of pleading, of a man who saw his crown shattered before everyone's eyes. Some businessmen, once submissive, now spat words of contempt, recalling past humiliations, ancient betrayals, and acts of arrogance they had endured in silence for years. Now, the mask had fallen, and nothing remained but shame. Raphael stepped forward and raised his voice once more. "You may have money, you may have power, but you will never have respect again. And respect is something all the gold in the world can't buy." The silence that followed was deafening, as if each person had absorbed the final sentence. Victor Callahan, once untouchable, now stood alone, defeated not by another tycoon or a worthy rival, but by a 13-year-old boy, the son of a simple maid. Victor was breathing heavily, as if every word he tried to utter was a desperate effort to regain an authority that no longer existed. The businessmen murmured among themselves, some already talking about calling the police, others about breaking the contracts immediately, but the millionaire, overcome with hatred, fixed his gaze on Raphael, the boy who had dared to challenge him in front of everyone. His eyes flashed, and the expression on his face was no longer one of control, but of pure resentment. "You think you've won, boy," he said, his voice low and full of venom. "You ruined my life, and I can ruin yours. Do you think anyone will believe a maid's son? When this mess is over, no one will remember you anymore, but everyone will know the price of humiliating me." The room fell silent, shocked by the explicit threat, but Raphael didn't look away. For the first time, a simple boy stood before one of the most powerful men in the country without trembling, and his posture spoke volumes. Marissa, until then silent, stepped forward and stood beside her son, lifting her chin with a dignity that drew gasps from the audience. "My son is not alone, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice firm and courageous. "What he said wasn't made up. It was the truth you try to hide from everyone here. You can try to intimidate him, you can try to humiliate me, but today the truth spoke louder, and there's nothing your money can buy to erase that." The impact of Marissa's words was immediate. Many business people, previously indecisive, began nodding in approval. Others murmured words of support, and even some who had previously remained neutral approached Raphael, symbolically placing themselves beside him. Victor realized he was increasingly alone, and the room that had previously bowed before his arrogance now erected barriers against his tyranny. The weight of loneliness fell on his shoulders as never before. Victor tried to laugh, but the sound that emerged from his throat was nothing more than a nervous noise, a broken laugh that betrayed more desperation than confidence. "You don't understand," he repeated, but his voice faltered, unable to command respect. Raphael then stepped forward, standing just a few feet away from the millionaire, and spoke with a clarity that made each word echo throughout the room. "You can try to threaten me. You can try to silence us. But the truth has already been told. Everyone here has heard it. And once the truth comes out, it can never be hidden again." The businessmen erupted in a murmur of approval, some applauding discreetly, others already demanding immediate legal action. Victor, pale and with trembling hands, looked around and realized the inevitable. His mask had shattered before everyone's eyes, and there was no way to rebuild it. The powerful millionaire was finished, defeated not by external enemies, but by the unexpected courage of a boy and his mother. The room erupted in firm, resolute voices, as if a wall of resistance had finally been erected against Victor Callahan. Businessmen who had previously bowed in silence now shouted demands. "You will pay for this. You have no more power here. It's over, Callahan." The sound of fists pounding on the table echoed like hammer blows, each gesture a testament to the exhaustion of patience. Raphael and Marissa, motionless in the center of the storm, watched the millionaires collapse like witnesses to a historic moment. Victor, staggering, tried to raise his hands, pleading for attention, but no one would give him any more space. The foreign investor, his face hard, raised his voice again. "This man no longer leads anything. From today on, he is nothing but a traitor." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout, as if everyone awaited Callahan's own reaction, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the words. Victor tried to counterattack with what little dignity he had left. "You can't remove me like this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I still control the shares. I still control the capital." But his attempt to reassert power sounded weak, empty, incapable of holding up against the avalanche of indignation that gripped the room. One of the lawyers, who had been loyal to the millionaire for years, stood up with eyes brimming with anger and said, "I defended you against accusations, Callahan, and today I realize I've always defended a liar." The words fell like sharp blows, and Victor felt his body sway, bracing himself on the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Raphael, beside his mother, watched everything attentively, but without arrogance, only with the silent conviction that justice was finally rising up against the lies. Marissa placed her hand on her son's shoulder, and together they seemed to radiate a strength no amount of money could buy. The mood in the room changed completely. There was no more laughter, no more masks. Every businessman positioned himself against Victor, and even the security guards who had previously followed orders in silence now hesitated, unsure whether to continue obeying a man in freefall. Victor looked up, seeking support, but found only icy stares and expressions that conveyed contempt. Raphael's voice, clear and firm, echoed again. "You no longer lead anything because you've lost the only thing that held that power, trust. And when that's broken, it never returns." A stray burst of applause arose in the background, followed by another. And within moments the entire room vibrated in a wave of applause that didn't celebrate Victor, but rather the unexpected courage of a boy who dared to speak. Callahan, defeated, retreated to the wall, his body heavy as lead, his shoulders hunched with shame. For the first time, everyone saw not the invincible tycoon, but an ordinary man stripped of everything, surrounded only by the echo of his ruin. Victor Callahan, once the man who dictated orders with a mere raise of his eyebrows, now lay in ruins before an audience that no longer owed him any reverence. His pale face and bloodshot eyes contrasted with the expensive suit that no longer conveyed power, but rather decadence. "You can't do this to me," he shouted again, but his voice sounded weak, drowned out by the murmur of men determined to no longer bow. The foreign investor, the natural leader of the rebellion, stood and declared firmly, "From this moment on, Victor Callahan is stripped of all leadership. Everyone here agrees that this man is a traitor." A wave of agreement echoed, firm voices joining in a chorus of approval, as if justice had finally taken place. Raphael watched the scene with attentive eyes, feeling that every word spoken was proof that his courage had changed everything. Marissa, standing beside her son, held his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face discreetly, but filled with pride. The lawyers gathered the documents that had been removed from the safe, spreading them out again on the table for analysis, confirming clause by clause that Victor had planned to deceive each partner present. One of the older businessmen, formerly a close friend of Callahan's, raised his voice amid the commotion. "I spent years trusting you, defending your name, and now I realize it was all a sham. You not only tried to steal from us, Victor, but you humiliated us all with your arrogance." The words were met with murmurs of agreement, and Callahan, without response, simply lowered his eyes, crushed by shame. Raphael took a deep breath and said aloud, without arrogance, but with the clarity of someone carrying the truth, "Everything I said was there, hidden in the safe. He believed no one would ever find out, but I heard, and I couldn't let you all be deceived." The room fell silent for a moment, absorbing the boy's words. Then the unexpected happened. One of the businessmen, a serious man with a deep voice, stood up and inclined his head slightly toward Raphael. "Boy, today you did what none of us had the courage to do. You faced the most powerful man in this room and exposed the truth." Other businessmen, one by one, began to nod. Some clapped. Others simply looked at him with genuine respect. Raphael, embarrassed, lowered his gaze slightly, but felt a flame burning within him, the certainty that he had done the right thing, even if his voice was small before so many. Marissa, moved, hugged her son by the shoulders and whispered, "You didn't just make me proud, Raphael. You showed everyone that the truth doesn't need wealth to be heard." Meanwhile, Victor retreated further and further, crushed by the weight of collective contempt, unable to believe that his ultimate downfall had been caused by the courage of a boy he had always considered insignificant. The room, now filled with heavy murmurs and scornful glances, seemed no longer the same space of luxury and ostentation that Victor Callahan had so prided himself on displaying. The glittering chandeliers no longer reflected power, but merely the shadow of an empire crumbling before everyone's eyes. Victor, hunched over and breathing heavily, tried to take another step forward, as if trying to cling to what little he had left, but was stopped by a group of businessmen who stood in his way, making it clear he no longer had a voice, nor a place among them. Raphael, standing firmly by his mother's side, watched with attentive eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. He had won not with strength, but with courage, and this made every beat of his heart sound like a drum of victory. Marissa clutched her son's hand with discreet tears, knowing that the boy had transformed, that night, into something greater than any millionaire could imagine. Victor looked up one last time, and his voice, now broken, came out as a lament filled with despair. "You'll regret it. None of you would have anything without me." But his words had no effect, merely the hollow echoes of a man who had lost everything. The foreign investor, who had maintained a rigid posture until then, slowly approached and said coldly, "There's nothing more to hear, Callahan. Your era has ended here." The silence that followed was deafening, and everyone could see in the millionaire's eyes the exact moment he realized he was finished. Trying to compose himself, Victor stumbled as he backed away, leaning against the wall, and for the first time in decades, he looked like an ordinary man, stripped of all power, surrounded by gazes that conveyed not respect, but revulsion. Raphael stepped forward and, in a firm voice, added, "I told you I knew your secret. Now everyone knows it too. The applause that rose was neither rehearsed nor restrained. It began timidly, coming from a corner, and soon filled the entire hall, echoing between the marble walls like a thunderclap of justice. Raphael, not fully understanding the magnitude of what he had done, lowered his eyes in shame, but felt a silent pride within. Marissa wrapped him in a tight embrace, as if to protect him from the entire world, and together they walked to the front door, amidst gazes of respect and admiration. Behind them, Victor stood, defeated, his imposing figure reduced to a forgotten shadow in the gloom of the hall. And as mother and son left the mansion, the cold night air enveloped them like a breath of freedom, bringing the certainty that the truth, however hidden, always finds its way to be revealed. The millionaire had frozen before the weight of justice, and that night would be forever marked as the day the maid's son dared to speak and brought down an entire empire. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.